also want to say that this is well, in some sense, an ongoing exercise which has been the core of my work, looking at agricultural science and technology and what it does to societies, or how societies shape agricultural science and technology. Basically work on India, so I'm not an expert on China or on India for that matter, but basically look at agricultural science. The work that NISTADS does, which is a small lab, well, the smallest and the only social science lab within the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. What we do is social studies of science, so there's a whole range of things ranging from history and philosophy of science to mathematical modeling and questions of scientometrics and so on that we do. That said, this paper kind of draws on work that we did. Nimi's here. Nimi was part of a project that we did together with a group of Chinese scholars, which is, I've mentioned it as SIID, Systems of Innovation for Inclusive Development, which was done over 3 years. What surprised me in that project was that right in 2007-08, when we started this negotiation about doing this project, and it was part of a seminar that was held in JNU, that this discussion came about looking at inclusive development. What do the Chinese and Indian governments mean by inclusive development? The Chinese scholars who kind of decided to collaborate with us did not want anybody else. The IDRC, which was funding it, of course, wanted to bring some Canadian researchers. They said, no, we'll do this as Indian and Chinese teams, and that was perhaps my only research project that I worked with Chinese scholars. But it was really refreshing to know that, well, there was a certain confidence that we could handle this on our own. So, well, there are a couple of other projects, especially this work that I did for the agricultural research policy questions. I mean, does India need an agricultural research policy? Like the European Standing Committee on Agricultural Research, do we need one? So there were questions of that sort, which we also tried to answer with another study. I'm just going to refer to a couple of these, partly because, and draw from these two, partly because some of these questions about how the rural is defined is something that we came up as a major, well, concern, because in India there is no definition of rural. Whatever is not urban is rural. And there are kind of statistics like population density, development indices, the proportion of agricultural workforce in these different regions, and rural-urban relationships, and what is the kind of relationship between the town and the village, the shaping the activities, the farm non-farm employment ratios, and so on, that are used by different people in different contexts. China also has more or less a similar kind of set of indices. Some of these things are a bit disturbing because, one, as countries which have massive rural populations and again a massive dependence on their agriculture sector, though of course the value of agriculture as you would see in the GDP, a share of GDP and so on, is really minimal now. There are questions that we need to ask ourselves. I mean, where do India and China draw their, well, let's say, valuations of agriculture from, and what does that mean for us as two countries, again, giant economies with massive and highly diverse, explosive diversity of agriculture. So what does this mean for us as two countries? I must again say that I'm not kind of trying to pose India and China as countries with massive agrarian populations and the desire for rural transformation against what is the, well, in some sense, inherited wisdom from the West. But it's important for us to question this because these are civilizations that have had, well, for instance, the very first civil service exam anywhere in the world for a public office, that is, or public administration position, is held in China. India had agricultural research done, as in formal public sector money given to agricultural science way before England did. So there are certain theories about rural development, about rural transformation that have been, let's say, learned or handed down from other parts of the world, which we've kind of lapped up without questioning. And this is something that we need to discuss, that I would like to address in this brief paper. What should rural transformation mean in India and China? And that's one of the key questions. For instance, is this an ends and means question? Is rural transformation needed for something, or is it an end in itself? There are various other terms and again other discourses that have appeared in the recent past: post-productivism, hybrid countryside, new rurality, and you name it. There's a whole range of things out there. But the question that we need to ask ourselves: what does that mean for labour, for instance, for women, for landless workers? I mean, not many in China, at least not as much as in India. Everybody has a piece of land, yes. Skills, caste, hierarchy, ethnicity. We heard about ethnic groups and their struggle for survival and their struggle for identity and keeping their ancestral land, as our previous speaker mentioned, about questions of migration. And if these questions are not asked, we're not addressing questions of rural transformation, and we hope that we're addressing rural transformation the way the West did. We are clearly on slippery grounds, and we need to actually engage with some of these questions. The second question is, where does agriculture figure? So, I mean, one of the basic arguments was that agriculture should be a transformative agent, multiplier effects. I mean, we've heard all these stories before. So, is agriculture a primary producer today? I mean, we know that agriculture today is not the net energy generator, energy producer that it was earlier. It is an energy guzzler. So, what does it mean in economic terms? And what does it mean for us in terms of our rural populations and the capacity of our rural populations to make decisions about what they want to do with their resources? I mean, coal is an extractive industry. Is agriculture an extractive industry? Well, it looks like it. So, what are we trying to do? I mean, what are we trying to do to what we call agriculture as primary production? And so, what kind of governance options are open today for us? So we come back to these two concerns. I have a very short presentation. We have time for discussion. So the context that I want to present, I mean, I'm just using this slide as an illustration, and it's something that I quite like, because what we kind of see in this slide is that India, or the largest subcontinent, and China, which once upon a time, well, let's say before 1750s, accounted for 50% of global trade, 80% of which was between these two regions. We know what happened after that, and they kind of fell down or declined in their share of global trade. They're picking up now, and like Varun said today, emerging, rising. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is a convergence of the global economies. Yeah, there is a convergence of different regions in terms of their economic might or size or whatever. And what we need to ask ourselves is, do we want to get into the same cycle as the West, the G7 has done now, and wait for another emergence, maybe Africa, we don't know, or do we need to think about what this convergence means? This is a very, let's say, celebrated convergence, that the emerging economies, they are eating into the share of global national income, and that was almost exclusively that of the Western powers, and therefore they're doing well. But how are we doing well, and what we're doing to our own, and this convergence marks a great dissonance and discomfiture within these economies, and are we asking questions about this? What is unsustainable about these Western economies and their decline is something that offers plenty of lessons for us, which we don't seem to be asking, especially given the fact that we are still talking about rural transformation, and our agrarian or agricultural workforce is still anywhere between 30 to 50% or 54% according to our latest census of the workforce. So we need to kind of look at this picture, this context within which India and China are located, to ask questions about where we're headed and what kind of rural transformation do we need, and do we want to get to where these nations were or are now, aggressively pushing at a global production frontier, for that matter. So this is just very briefly some of the work that we did in the India-SIR project, and what the kind of questions we had was India and China. Well, massive poverty even today. I'm not going to get into any of these data questions, but the question of persistence of rural poverty is something that comes up repeatedly in the literature and in our official data from both the countries. There is regional differentiation, there is a dependence on agrarian income, India is likely to remain poorer for longer. I mean, that's another prediction. And these, well, this kind of data, which looks like bland statistics, has to do with the kind of agriculture that we have and the kind of agriculture that the states, both the states, have been promoting in our countries. Rural populations bearing the brunt of this kind of well, rapid growth. We know that rapid growth has been the scene for these two countries. Has been quite celebrated, yes. What do we need to ask about the, well, let's say, the steady erosion of rural production systems? What do we need to ask about the ways in which in both the countries poverty is not just because nothing's being done, but because something is being done by the state, and what is being done by the state to eat into or to erode the existing production capacities in these societies. The state, of course, is doing a lot. There's this whole, both India and China seem to be seeking the same well, goal, inclusion and whatnot. What's being done are mainly redistribution efforts. There's increasing expenditure in rural development and for rural flagship programs for the poor and so on. Public sector mandates ranging from rural health missions to education to infrastructure to drinking water. There's a whole range of public sector mandates to engage with rural and backward areas. There are new public-private partnerships, and that is again very actively promoted by both these governments, both the Union government and the Chinese government. Again, investments in a lot of extractive industries, we've seen some of that now, and manufacturing industries. Manufacturing industries, again, we have excellent papers from both the countries. The literature is really rich with the kind of well, manufacturing investment. For instance, a 15% growth rate in what's considered the heavy industry, or cars and automobiles and those kinds of industries, and very limited or really deceleration of the manufacturing sector, as in, you know, the middle manufacturing sector, which is what Indian employment would gain from. So the nature of investment is something that we need to question here. Again, though rural transformation is supposed to be the objective, and attempts to enable and promote pro-poor knowledge and technology generation. And here again, what kind of investments go into these attempts is interesting. There are again at least 4 or 5 papers that have appeared in the past 5 years comparing, for instance, the ways in which agricultural knowledge is generated, and agricultural reform of public sector agricultural research has been attempted in these two countries. Basically asking questions about how can India learn from what China has done. Yeah. Now, what is not stated here is the fact that the very structure of Chinese agricultural research is very different from what it is in India, and that the nature of the rice-wheat cropping system, I mean the rice-wheat dominant monocultures that we have here, is not the same in China as we have here. That there is a difference in the nature of cropping, in the nature of engagement with rural communities, and the nature of extension systems. We'll talk about that in a while. But basically, the attempts to enable, promote, or you know, these kinds of knowledge and technology generation measures, and the literature about these, are in some sense not engaging with questions of existing structures and what governs these activities. What are the kind of institutions or norms that they respond to, and what they govern these activities. So what we have in terms of a broad conceptualization of what we're doing to our rural areas is there is a set of theories that inform these programs. Previous ones we spoke about, and we've umpteen examples from India and China. But they seem to draw on a set of theories that were developed in Europe, in the US, in conditions that were very different from ours, in conditions that did not have the kind of rural labor that we had. I mean, not this 400, 500 millions that we're talking about. 6 million, maybe 60 at best, if you put together all of Europe. So it's the Marshall Plan that moved or dealt with depeasantization, moved people from rural areas into urban employment and industry, had to deal with a far, far lesser pain of structural unemployment than we do, I mean, that India and China do. And my argument is that unless and until we look at where these theories come from, I mean, I think Nimi spoke about the ways in which certain theories have evolved or certain texts have evolved in certain contexts, and how they kind of get translated or get used in other contexts without without relating to those contexts and the evolutionary processes that are in shape or in place in these contexts. Maybe it's not like the distance between Kautilya and now, but definitely these theories, there's been Douglas years talking about birth, life and death of development economics, but a lot of that still informs the ways in which our decisions are made. So it's NERC's talking about idle peasant labor, and here we are talking about agricultural communities which are 95%, 86% in China and in India, small farmers, small as in marginal and small as in really small, less than 1 hectare, less than 2 hectares in India together. So we're talking about peasant labor that is not really idle, but is engaging with these small production systems and their productivity in a much more intense fashion than NERCs would ever have known. But then, the point is that these theories, moving idle peasants, there is an podcast available from London School of Economics talking about how India and China should move people out of, this is 2 years ago, where leading economists were speaking about the ways in which India and China can do this, and how it is without moving people out of rural areas, out of agriculture, there is no hope for these countries. Now, what that means for India and China in terms of urbanization, in terms of energy requirements, in terms of the kind of agriculture that we would have, is a totally different question. Of course, China has made much better progress and far ahead in terms of, opportunities for rural non-farm employment for the small farmers. Yeah? But even then, it's these kinds of theories that inform the ways in which our investments are still being done in rural areas, including, of course, the post-Meller and Johnston phase, which was, of course, investments in technologies and the ways in which agriculture itself would play a major role in creating these multiplier effects and so on. Now, what is interesting is that in all these theories, or especially in the later versions, Johnston and Meller kind of version, which is in some sense historical and probably really dated, that the messages for capital formation in agriculture and capital formation for agriculture have been swallowed completely, in total, by both the governments, by the Indian and Chinese governments. And capital formation in agriculture, interestingly, is now a concern, yes, but far greater is the concern about capital formation for agriculture, as in roads and infrastructure, fertilizers and chemicals, and this whole range of post-harvest technology, and it's allegedly supposed to help agriculture, and again, ask questions about what kind of growth do we need, what kind of energy, what kind of coal extraction do we need to fuel all this. Yeah? So the focus is on a whole range of input technologies, and which would ultimately lead to greater production productivity. And the truth about these two countries, just facts and figures from within these countries, shows that there are still millions going hungry in these countries. There is a lot of productivity questions that are being left unanswered. So, just to illustrate, very briefly, the extent of decentralized production systems that China has is far greater than India has. And so there is a question of what kind of engagements does, what kind of structures in terms of the kind of pipelines, the kind of processes that the state has in China, which is far more decentralized, far more, let's say, participatory in nature at the local level than India has, which is not, again, discussed in the popular perception. Extension, the R&D institutes, almost 50% of China's agricultural research institutes, for that matter, are funded, established and run by the local governments. That is unimaginable in India. There's just some statistics, but basically to show that agriculture today is really not a primary sector in both these countries. So in terms of the theories that we've seen earlier, whether it's movement of idle peasants or the multiplier effects and so on, what does the sector mean today for these two countries? What does agriculture mean as the intermediary sector, which draws inputs from, and in a major way? We've seen the whole question about subsidies, about pollution, climate change negotiations, all these discussions that India and China figure in now. Energy, pollution, yes. So they are all well, they all hinge on this assumption that agriculture is a primary sector and it's producing, food for our populations and so on. But yes, food is being produced, but at what cost and how, and what are the kind of regional differences? There's a lot to be said on the regional differences part, but time. So this is partly a quotation from some of these popular papers about India and China, and that agricultural performance, especially in China and partly in India, is consistent with the expected economic growth trajectory, and so it's consistent with development economics theories. Yes. Surpluses, yes, surpluses are being generated. If we look at an alternative framework, look at where these investment goods and consumption goods are going, and what are the kind of investment goods versus consumption goods questions. In terms of let's say a Kelleskian imagination of what do the workers, what do the rural producers get to consume, and what do they get to access of the kind of production and surpluses that they are generating. What is it that moves out in terms of investment goods that goes into other sectors, in terms of what goes into investments, and again investment goods that are moved completely out of the rural scenario, in terms of the employment opportunities, the infrastructure, in terms of incomes that go into so-called elite or middle class consumption. There are some questions that we need to ask here. Consistent with rural transformation, we don't know. If rural transformation means mainly agricultural production intensity, maybe yes, in some parts. About 60% of India, or Indian arable land, which is arid, semi-arid, or rain-fed agriculture, will never achieve that kind of production intensity in terms of grain yield. But production intensity in terms of systems performance, systems productivity is perhaps yes. But we don't have the natural or social science capacities to measure these systems productivities, and that's something that we've often been stumbling upon. So what do we want in terms of rural transformation studies in India and China? What do we want to know? Do we want to know how agriculture figures in this? Or do we want to kind of understand why we keep using the same methods that we've been told not to use? I mean, 1979, in this WCS paper on birth, life and death of development economics, we still use the same tools. We heard Habermas and conceptualizations of identities and the role of the state and so on. That does not enter the heads of the policymakers. I'm sorry to say this, but policymakers seem to be completely immune to a whole range of social science questions. We did a discussion on the kind of rural transformation that would come with the so-called green growth scenarios that we have now. I mean, it's just blatant extraction that comes with green growth. I mean, there is no concern about what happens to the rural producer, the rural resources, and again, a whole range of systems that are related to it, especially gender and caste systems in India. Decentralized governance discussed as a panacea, as a kind of management is very, very welcome. But decentralized governance discussed as a political redistribution of, well, access to the sources of production, gains from the production systems that are available to these rural, in other words, the kind of valuation questions of each of these resources. Land, in particular, water, a whole range of inputs, especially human energy that goes into the production systems. Energy guzzling with cheap fossil fuels is the answer now. So we kind of, in a very Weblenian sense, seem to have accepted the ceremonial value of rural transformation, the ceremonial institutions that come with rural transformation, or the ideas that come in from the West. Do we really need to develop in the sequential fashion that the West has? Well, I mean, I really don't know, but it doesn't look like it's possible, and it doesn't look like it'll be, without much pain if our politicians and policymakers and academics don't engage with these questions now. I mean, whatever we do, I mean, emerging, rich, whatever economies that we are, unless we address the rural question and address the rural question with reference to the kinds of processes of transformation that we seem to be pushing today, especially questions of investments in consumption, investment goods and consumption goods in particular, we're not getting anywhere. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Raina. I think the paper has really raised a lot of key debates and questions on development discourse going on between India and China. So can we open the floor for Q&A before we take up the third one, which is also very, very important, mobilization politics in a while.
Should I put up the question for both the speakers right now?
Up to you, yeah, both the speakers.
Okay, so while I was listening to your talk, Dr. Raina, I was trying to transport these things in the context of my domain. So what we see, what is basically in parallel, we have a digital divide. We have a kind of digital division in cyberspace. So there are less connected, less developed areas, and then there are very well connected and well facilitated areas. So my question to you is that how does the role of rural transformation in India and China is being related with the question of sovereignty and food security? Because if I recall that India's Green Revolution program was launched as a response to attain more kind of sovereign status, to respond to certain kind of measures which were imposed on us because we were part of the non-alignment movement. So, and in cyberspace what happens that if you don't comply to certain policy made by a Western nation state, then they can use cross-domain measures against you on Western. In the context of agriculture, how the question of food security and sovereignty is being seen in the context of India and China. And my question to you, two questions very quickly. You spoke about uninvited participants, and when I think in terms of my domain, I see hacktivists, right? Hacktivists are, the way I understand your presentation, are basically uninvited participants. What platforms in your domain are being used by uninvited participants to register their protest, besides direct protests like it happened in Chipko movement? Second question, you spoke about Jharkhand and Khujao province. Is there, and my sense was, if I am correct, is there an inverse relationship between development and income? Because development and developing that region and the economic development of the inhabitants of that province. Because the way I see it in my domain, more connected a state is, higher the risks from the perspective of cybersecurity, more nodes you have to attack, more connected you are, less security you have. I mean, that's from, so my question to you is that, am I correct in anticipating that there is an inverse relationship between development and income? You quoted Jharkhand and
yeah.
Can we take some more?
My question is for Pin. I found it very interesting what you were saying about the different attitudes in Jharkhand and in Guizhou about the attitude about the land. You talked about sons of the soil in Jharkhand and a devotion to the land. We would rather die than give up our land, and compared it to China, where central state policy is going to be the defining thing. You don't find the same sorts of attitudes. And you talked about language as being very instrumental in forming this kind of distinct attitudes in the two countries. But I also wondered about if you could say something about what you thought the role of land reform and land ownership systems in the two countries was, because it seems to me that could be quite key, the very different system of land ownership, and obviously 1950s land reform in China seems to me to potentially have quite a big impact on the way people think about their land in China and the state's role in their land.
This question is on the agriculture. My question is on the agriculture and transformation in the issues of climate change. Because in China, the urban development and rate of urbanization is very high. And this year it's almost 55 and it is bound to go till 60% in the next 5 years. So as far as climate change things are concerned, recently both India and China, they have developed, the Indian states and the Chinese provinces have developed their climate change policies with the help of UNDP. So do you think that following the model that UNDP is promoting to formulate our climate change policies is good for rural development in India and China?
Then we have a couple of questions more. So do you want to respond to these first and then we
Do you want to take this? Thank you. Adi, yes, I mean, there is a digital divide question here too. I mean, in terms of divide, yes. Access to information is important for rural development and for agriculture, but the question is how, you know, and information, for instance, coded within a seed can also be accessed by farmers, but information given to farmers about pest emergence would rule out the need for that information for pest resistance to be coded within the seed, right? I mean, if there is a very, very good example in India of digital use of the ICT technology, again, ICT with 28 field stations, training of pest scouts, building capacities for rural communities or within rural communities to attack a group of pests that attack cotton, soybean, pulses, 4 crops in Maharashtra, which is launched with the National Center for Integrated Pest Management. Look up their website. It's a really good project, and that really asks the questions about some really good questions about GM technologies. I mean, do you really need GM seeds if you can do this with such good results without transforming your genetic material? Yeah, so that's one part. About non-compliance in agricultural trade and sovereignty questions. Well, I mean, I won't say anything about the Green Revolution now, but I mean, for food sovereignty, I mean, there are plenty of examples of food sovereignty being achieved by individual communities in India and in China. Again, not through the mechanisms that are being promoted by the state in these two countries, but by communities and by community involvement with their agroecological systems and nurturing both human and ecological security. So there are, and that is real food sovereignty, not food sovereignty as one country versus the other. I mean, it's not, and that's, so the definition of food security versus food sovereignty itself is separate. About climate change, again, I don't think the UNDP kind of tools help very much. It's the same old policy jukebox. There is nothing new that's there in that, and it's actually, if anything, a travesty. It's really sad.
I will try to answer the question. And first, I will try from the one I can answer first. Regarding the land reform, actually, there are some like historical comparative studies on China and India regarding the land reform, and some claim that, for example, like Morris and some others claim that actually in China, the land reform or social reform that comes exhaustively remove the social hierarchy of the society, but actually that I couldn't explain earlier, like actually the hierarchy exists in Chinese society as well. And when the government claimed that, okay, the man can conquer the nature, however, for the people, it's more like, oh, we need to respect the Tian, or we need to respect the inherent force. So actually the hierarchy comes like this way, the Mandarin or the political elite, and then the environment or the inherent force, and then the people. So in this way, like when you're talking about the land reform, actually I think in core area it's slightly different from agricultural land, because when I ask people about like, oh, how is the household responsibility system, is it exist here? They say, oh, since earlier when the government want to boom the core production, they just claim that all the land they claim the utility dominate right, the state get the land from the people, so that after that, the land didn't go back to the household anymore. So it's slightly different from that system. I don't know whether you can show it. And then the uninvited participation. It's actually in another chapters I deal with that issue more. And what I mean about uninvited participation in this area is more like, for example, like koala, they transport the coal illegally to like earn something by these natural resources themselves, which is not recognized by the law. But however, in China, there's something similar but slightly different, because nowadays they don't transport coal with cycle, they do truck, right? But still there's some ambiguous space for them. But the very different thing is when I see Sakawala in rural jargon, it's like a rolling. They just do it openly. However, in China, they have to do that very secretly, and they can do it only at night. That, for me, is like some of this uninvited participation. And also the two different, when I talk about participation, environmental participation, the elitism represent very differently in the two countries. For example, like the activists who broke the law or who was in jail, for example, like Diamond Bala in Jharkhand, she can still recognize as elite. Like she represents the AIP as a candidate. However, in China, it was like when the scholars or the activists talking about participation, they will say, oh, we can allow participation, but because people don't have enough information to participate. But this is the issue of the state, right? They should make the information public. But they say, oh, people don't have enough information to participation, so they are irrational participants. So only there are some elites who have sufficient information, and for them to participate in our debates is okay. But others, they are like irrational, or they have external purpose. Yeah, something like that. So it's about the uninvited participation. And the second question of you, I didn't get it.
We can discuss that later.
Thank you very much. I thought both papers were excellent. One question, or two questions to pin. One which is about India and China. What is the politics of compensation? It's something we don't teach in the study of development, but it's very important when we're looking at the concept of development involving extractive industrialization. The second is more a comment on uninvited participation, because I've been looking at illegal coal in Jharkhand, which provides livelihoods to hundreds of thousands of people and may dispose of anywhere between 25 and maybe 40% of the coal that is mined in certain parts of Jharkhand, in the 8 coal districts. So there is, I could talk for hours and hours about this, but there is a huge criminal economy dominated by mafia, spreading its tentacles not just the length and breadth of Jharkhand, but right up to Delhi, and undermining the sub-nationalist discourse of tribal aspiration, but also undermining the actual development trajectory, which you don't consider at all, but it affects a narrative of rural development, and especially this very interesting narrative that you focused on of rural development, not as agricultural development, but as industrial development. Okay, and to Raji, thank you, and it's just a question, you simply said something that we all probably agree with, which is that policymakers are not very interested in agriculture. And so I wonder whether that's true in China, and why you think that is. Because after all, feeding the cities, as a greater and greater percent of India's population lives in cities, so the conditions under which food surpluses are extracted and supplied to cities becomes ever more important. And in particular, I would like you to develop three things that I know you are expert in. One is why you have gigantism in agricultural policy, why your concern about agricultural systems, farming systems, is the poor relation, and often laughed out, of course, not considered seriously in agricultural policy. Second is your interest in the small farmer, yeah, in what I would call petty commodity production, with people who don't accumulate. Why is there not a project for rural and urban firms which don't accumulate? And lastly, the sacrosanctity of agriculture against any attempts to plan a low-carbon trajectory.
Maybe take down